Beneath the vast evening sky, when the crimson light of the sinking sun lingered like a veil upon the mountains, silence pressed upon the Apache village as if the earth itself held its breath. Yet, within that stillness, a young girl's heart beat with a trembling so fierce it seemed to echo louder than the drums of any ceremony. Her name was Nayeli, 17 summers old, soft as the morning dew, and her spirit had never known chains until this day. Whispers had carried through the night fires, whispers that crept into her sleep and stole away her peace. She was to wed a cowboy from the nearby settlement, a man whose name was spoken like a curse. They called him Ruthless, his stare cold as steel, his hand swifter than any outlaw, his silence a warning to all who dared to cross him. Men told tales of him firing shots without hesitation, of never bending, never softening, never forgiving. To the villagers, he was strength made into flesh. To Nayeli, he was the shadow that loomed at the edge of her fragile world. She sat by her grandmother's fire that evening, her eyes wide with dread, her small hands clenched in her lap as though holding herself together. The flames danced before her, but all she could see were the dark rumors of this husband-to-be. She whispered her fears into the night, hoping the wind would carry them away, but the fear clung tightly, settling deep into her chest. Her cousins mocked her fate, saying she would live with a man who cared more for his horse than for his wife. Each word fell heavy, like stones cast upon her soul, and she wondered if perhaps they were right. Could her life be ending before it had even begun? Healing words from her grandmother's lips tried to soothe her, telling her that stories grow larger than truth, but Nayeli's tears still found their way to her blanket at night. Fear can carve deeper than any blade, and hers was etched into her bones. When dawn came, the day of meeting him at last, her body shook as though the earth itself quivered beneath her. She braided her dark hair with trembling fingers, her little sister's hands steadying what hers could not. The simple dress sewn by her mother clung to her like a shroud. She was not adorned like a bride filled with joy, but dressed as though being sent to meet a fate she could not resist. Outside, the village stirred, children running to glimpse the stranger, men standing tall to greet or to guard. The air carried the sound of approaching hooves, each beat striking her heart like a drum of war. She lowered her eyes, staring at the earth, because she dared not face him. The whispers surged again. That is him, the ruthless one. Her knees threatened to buckle. She expected cruelty in his voice, harshness in his hand, a shadow of the monster the world had painted. But when his presence stood before her, when her name was called and she stepped forward into the weight of destiny, she felt a quiet confusion. He did not seize her hand with violence. He tipped his hat, his greeting simple, his tone steady but not sharp. The ground beneath her seemed to tilt, for nothing in that moment matched the stories she had believed. Her heart, however, clung stubbornly to fear. Perhaps he hid his cruelty behind calmness, waiting for solitude to reveal his true nature. Her palms were damp, her body rigid as she climbed onto the horse behind him. The road stretched endless before them, and Nayeli sat stiff, every muscle braced for the storm she believed was coming. Yet, as the journey began, shadows of doubt flickered inside her fortress of fear. She noticed the gentleness of his grip on the reins, never yanking the horse's mouth, always guiding with steady hands. She saw how he slowed when the ground grew rough, as though to shield her from falling. And then, as if heaven itself wished to stir her heart, a small child appeared on the path, crying for his mother. Naeli's breath caught as the cowboy stopped, climbed down, and knelt. His voice softened like water over stone as he comforted the child, guiding him patiently back to safety. No cruelty lived in that moment, only kindness. Naeli's heart faltered, struck by a confusion more piercing than fear. Could this truly be the man they called Ruthless? The day stretched long, the land wide and open, and every step carried Naeli deeper into the unknown. She saw his hand rest gently upon his horse's neck, whispering words not of command but of comfort. She saw him offer her water before taking a sip himself, his small courtesies contradicting the darkness painted by rumor. Her fear did not vanish, but cracks began to form in the walls she had built around her heart. That night, under a sky stitched with stars, he built a fire and handed her bread without command, his presence steady, his silence not sharp, but patient. For the first time she dared to glance at him fully. His face, hardened by years of labor, carried lines of strength, yes, but also something deeper, something she could not yet name, perhaps sorrow, perhaps patience, perhaps both. Her mind spun with uncertainty as sleep crept upon her. Fear still whispered, but curiosity began to whisper louder. She prayed quietly beneath the stars, asking for clarity, asking for peace, asking for healing from the terror that had gripped her for so long. The road ahead was unknown, but already, in the smallest gestures, light began to seep through the cracks of her dread. The story that began in trembling fear was shifting, though she did not yet know toward what end. And as she drifted into uneasy dreams, she held a fragile hope that the days to come would reveal the truth, not the tales told by others, but the reality she would see with her own eyes. My dear friend, if this tender beginning has stirred your heart, if it awakened in you even a spark of curiosity about what lies ahead for Naeli and the man shrouded in rumors, I invite you gently, like a whisper beneath the stars, to stay close on this journey. Leave a thought in the comments. Let your voice be part of the firelight where stories are shared. Subscribe so that the next chapter may find you when the night is long and you seek a little healing warmth. And if your soul feels touched, let your support be known. For together we can walk further into the heart of this tale. The morning rose in silence, soft beams of light brushing across the plains like a tender hand upon weary skin. Naeli stirred from uneasy dreams, her body stiff from sleeping on the ground, her mind still heavy with doubts that clung like shadows. The fire beside her had dwindled to embers, glowing faintly in the cool dawn. She turned her gaze to where the cowboy moved with quiet purpose, his hands steady as he adjusted the saddle, checked the straps, and brushed down his horse with a gentleness that did not fit the tales of ruthlessness. For a brief moment she simply watched, forgetting her fear. The world around her hushed, as if urging her to notice the truth before her eyes. When he caught sight of her awake, he did not order her to rise, nor scold her for lingering in the warmth of her blanket. Instead, he handed her a piece of bread, his movements calm, respectful, almost careful, as though he understood she was fragile and wished not to break her. She accepted it with trembling fingers, nodding her thanks, though no words came. The silence between them stretched, yet it was not harsh. It was a silence filled with space, like the quiet meadow where wildflowers bloom unseen. She realized that silence could sometimes be healing, a gentle pause that gave room for the heart to breathe. As they set out again, the road winding across the open plains, Naeli sat behind him, her hands hesitant upon the saddle. She kept her distance, afraid of leaning too close, but the rhythm of the horse's gait forced her nearer at times, her heart beating wildly each time her shoulder brushed his back. He did not turn, did not comment, and she wondered if he noticed at all. Instead, his eyes scanned the horizon, steady and watchful, not with paranoia, but with a quiet readiness shaped by long days in untamed lands. She studied him in fragments, the curve of his shoulders, the calm set of his jaw, the way he never moved in haste. Each detail told her something her fears could not erase. Cruelty rushes, but patience waits. And here before her was a man who waited. The horse stumbled once on loose ground, and instinctively she reached out, her hand clutching his arm in sudden panic. The warmth beneath her touch startled her as much as the slip itself. She expected him to recoil, to snap at her, to confirm the darkness of the stories, but he only steadied the horse, his voice low and even, almost soothing. "It's all right. You're safe." The words lingered in her mind long after they rode on, echoing like a soft hymn in the hollow of her chest. Could a ruthless man speak with such healing calm? By midday, they reached a small trading post, and Naeli's heart tightened with new dread. She feared the eyes of strangers, feared how they might treat her as his wife, feared what truths might reveal themselves. The townsfolk watched him with a curious mix of respect and caution. Some nodded stiffly, stepping aside as he passed, as though unwilling to linger near him. Their fear mirrored her own people's whispers, but then something unexpected shattered the image once more. A little girl with a broken toy ran up to him, tugging at his sleeve. Naeli's breath caught, certain he would dismiss the child, but instead he knelt, listening carefully to her small voice. From his pocket he drew a string, binding the toy with patient hands until it was whole again. The girl's eyes sparkled, her smile wide, and he patted her head gently before rising. Around them no one spoke, no one acknowledged what they had seen, but Naeli had seen it clear as day. His kindness was not an accident, nor a rare moment. It lived in him quietly, unspoken, like the steady flow of a hidden spring. Later, she watched as he noticed an old woman carrying a sack too heavy for her bent frame. Without words, he stepped forward, lifted the burden, and set it upon her cart. He waited for no thanks, asked for no praise, simply returned to his horse with the same calm expression. Naeli's heart trembled. Why, then, did the world call him ruthless? Was strength so easily mistaken for cruelty, patience for coldness, silence for emptiness? Back on the road, she dared her first question, her voice thin as a thread. "Do you live alone?" The question hung fragile in the air, but he turned slightly, surprise flickering in his glance before he answered. "Yes, just me, the horse, and a few ranch hands." His tone held no edge, no suspicion, only simple truth. She nodded quickly, unable to find more words, but a spark of courage had been lit. It was small, but it warmed her, a seed waiting for sun. That evening, as the sun melted into rivers of gold across the fields, they stopped by a wide meadow. Together they gathered sticks for the fire, the first time her hands moved beside his in quiet labor. She felt clumsy, but when he noticed, he did not mock. He handed her a small bundle, his eyes meeting hers briefly, and asked softly, "Are you all right?" The question was so ordinary, so human, yet it pierced through the walls she had built. She nodded, unable to voice the storm in her chest, and his small nod in return carried more weight than 100 words. For the first time, she felt seen. That night, lying beneath the vast sky, she thought of the way he had spoken to the child, the way he had carried the old woman's burden, the way he had steadied her when she slipped. None of it matched the shadow of ruthlessness. And yet, fear does not vanish overnight. Doubt whispered still, reminding her of the villagers' tales, the cousins' cruel laughter, the way strangers stepped aside at his presence. Could it be that she saw only a mask now, and that something harsher waited beneath? She did not know. But as she closed her eyes, she whispered a prayer, not only for strength, but for clarity, for the healing of truth. The next morning came crisp with a cool wind, carrying scents of grass and distant rain. When she tried to mount the horse, her foot slipped, and she nearly fell. In a swift motion, his hand caught her arm, steadying her before she could hit the ground. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that gaze she saw no anger, no coldness, only a quiet strength, a steady presence that anchored her fear. Embarrassed, she looked away, mumbling a broken apology. He said nothing, simply helped her settle, making sure she was secure before they moved on. That small moment, simple as it was, stayed with her longer than any story she had ever heard. The second day's ride stretched across hills softened by tall grass swaying in the wind. The land itself seemed to whisper of healing, as though urging her to breathe deeper. Her fear was no longer sharp like a knife, but dulled into confusion. She no longer knew what to believe. The stories had painted him as merciless, yet every action contradicted the image. And for the first time, alongside her fear, curiosity bloomed quietly, tender as the first green shoot after winter. When the horizon opened and the ranch appeared, wooden fences stretching wide, the barns standing sturdy against the hills, dogs running with joy, her heart pounded. This was to be her new home. She braced for harshness, but instead she found workers greeting him with respect that felt sincere, their faces open and unafraid. Inside the house she expected command, but found a small room prepared for her, with clean sheets and a folded quilt waiting. His words were simple. "This is yours. You'll be comfortable here." She stood speechless, the echo of dread in her heart faltering beneath the weight of reality. That night she sat by the window, watching laughter spill from the men outside, hearing no fear in their voices. The word ruthless echoed again, but it rang hollow now, a shell of truth crumbling beneath what her eyes could see. Slowly, without her willing it, the walls of fear began to loosen. And though doubt still lingered, though questions still circled, something fragile was being born within her, a trust that might yet grow into something stronger. The days of terror were not gone, but the dawn of healing had begun. The third day dawned with a sky painted in soft hues of rose and pale gold, the air cool and clean, carrying the scent of wild grass across the open plain. Nayeli woke to the quiet murmur of the ranch awakening around her, the low calls of cattle, the shuffle of boots on earth, the distant bark of dogs. She sat by the small window of the room he had given her, her fingers resting on the edge of the quilt, still unable to believe such a space was hers. She had expected cold walls, harsh commands, a prison dressed as a home. Instead, she found simple comfort, a room prepared not out of duty but of thought, the faint fragrance of soap lingering on the sheets. It was a gesture that unsettled her fears more than words ever could. She stepped out into the morning light hesitantly, her heart still unsure of where it belonged. Workers moved with steady rhythm, carrying water, feeding livestock, repairing tools. Each man greeted the cowboy with respect, not the fearful stiffness she had seen in strangers, but the kind of respect born from trust. He worked beside them, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands rough with labor, never placing himself above them. She watched from the porch, her eyes tracing the way he bent to lift wood, the way he listened when a younger worker spoke, nodding without impatience. Her chest tightened with a strange feeling she could not name. It was not love yet, not even peace, but the beginning of something healing, a soft stirring that whispered of safety. When he noticed her standing quietly, he did not summon her forward. He did not demand her help, nor ask her to stay hidden. Instead, his eyes met hers briefly, steady and calm, as if to say, "You may choose your place here." That small freedom struck her more deeply than chains of fear ever had. She lingered near the porch, sometimes stepping forward to sweep or carry small things. The first time she tried, clumsy with the broom, she expected a sharp word, but he only said gently, "You don't have to, but if it makes you feel at home, that's fine." Those words wrapped around her like a soft shawl, and for the first time since leaving her village, she smiled without trembling. The days unfolded in this quiet rhythm, each one peeling away another layer of dread. She began to notice how the animals trusted him, the dogs bounding toward him with wagging tails, the horses lowering their heads to his touch, even the cattle settling at the sound of his voice. One afternoon she stood by the fence and watched him break a wild horse. She braced for harshness, for the violence of force. But instead, his hands moved slowly, his voice low, his patience unbroken, even as the animal fought. Hours passed, the sun bending toward the horizon, and at last the horse stood calm beneath his hand. She realized then that his strength was not cruelty. It was endurance, the kind that healed fear rather than inflicted it. That night, a storm rolled across the plains, thunder cracking the sky, winds lashing against the house. Naeli, unused to such rage from the heavens, curled beneath her blanket, fear clutching her heart. But then she noticed a soft glow at her door. A lantern had been placed there, its flame steady against the storm. He had left it quietly, without words, but the gesture spoke louder than any promise. Tears filled her eyes, not from fear this time, but from comfort. She whispered a prayer of thanks, her voice breaking with a healing she had not known she needed. The next days deepened her understanding. When a young ranch hand spilled grain from a torn sack, she expected the cowboy to lash out. Instead, he knelt, helping to gather what could be saved, showing the boy how to tie the sack properly. Naeli's breath caught. This was no ruthless tyrant, but a man who taught with fairness. One evening, she cut her hand while preparing food. Before she could hide it, he was there, his touch firm but gentle as he wrapped her wound with cloth. His voice steady, reassuring. "You'll be all right. Don't worry." In that moment, she saw him not as the shadow of rumor, but as a man whose kindness revealed itself in quiet acts, healing without ceremony. Still, doubts whispered. One night she overheard workers speaking of his past, a fight years ago where he had faced outlaws without flinching, his name earned through unyielding strength. "That's why they call him Ruthless," one said. "He doesn't bend, he doesn't fear." Nayeli's chest tightened, torn between the image of the man she now saw and the legend carried by whispers. Could he be both? Could gentleness and ruthlessness live in the same heart? The questions circled her mind like restless birds, but as she lay beneath the silver light of the moon, she realized something. The world judged only by what it saw in battle, not by the everyday truths of his life. And perhaps she too had been blind to what lay beneath. Her fear no longer ruled her as it once had. In its place grew respect, curiosity, and the fragile beginnings of trust. She began to speak more, small questions at first, about the cattle, about the land, about the changing seasons. His answers were simple but patient, his voice carrying the steady cadence of a man rooted in the earth. She began to laugh quietly at small things, and when she did, he listened as though it mattered. Sometimes she found water waiting by her door on hot days, an extra blanket folded when nights grew cold, or once a small wildflower placed silently on the porch. He never spoke of these gestures, but she knew, and each one broke another stone from the wall around her heart. One evening, sitting beside him on the porch, the sky blazing with the colors of dusk, she whispered, "I was afraid of you." Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. He did not turn right away. He only nodded slowly, his gaze on the horizon. "I know. Everyone tells stories. They don't always tell the truth." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were no longer the tears of fear. They were tears of release, of a burden finally lifting. "You are not ruthless," she said softly, firmly. His eyes found hers then, and for the first time she saw them clearly. Steady, not cold, carrying the weight of weariness, but also the warmth of something unspoken. His reply was quiet, but it carried the force of a vow. "I'm glad you see that." In that moment, something bloomed between them, fragile yet strong, like a flower pushing through stone. Not forced, not hurried, but born of patience, of steady trust, of kindness that healed more than it commanded. The world might still whisper his name with fear, but Nayeli's heart had found a different truth. She no longer trembled in his presence. Instead, she stood beside him with a heart that was no longer chained by dread, but touched by hope. Her journey had begun in terror, but in the warmth of small gestures and the healing power of patience, she found herself walking towards something she had never expected, the tender dawn of love. And as the stars emerged that night, she lifted her face to the sky, her lips curving in the quietest of smiles, for the walls around her heart had crumbled, leaving room for a beginning she had once thought impossible. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of the earth. Morning light spilled across the ranch, washing the wooden fences in gold, and Nayeli began to step into that light without the heaviness of fear pressing so sharply upon her. She would walk near the barns, carry small pails of water, or sweep the porch, her movements quiet yet growing in confidence. The dogs followed her now, tails wagging, and the men who worked the land greeted her with gentle nods. She realized, slowly, that she was no longer a stranger among them. She belonged to this place, not by force, but by the healing patience of time and kindness. The cowboy remained steady in her eyes, distant yet near, silent yet speaking through every act. His silence no longer frightened her. It soothed her. When storms threatened, she remembered the lantern he had left by her door, its light stronger than thunder. When her hands fumbled with a task, she recalled the way he had steadied her without scorn. These small threads wove themselves into a tapestry of trust, and though her heart still trembled at times, it was no longer with dread, but with an awakening she could not yet name. One afternoon the air shifted with unease. She heard the ranch hands speaking in low voices by the barn, their words carrying like sharp edges through the wind. Cattle rustlers had been spotted nearby, men who swept across the plains like shadows, stealing under the cover of dust and night. Fear pricked her chest as she listened, the old dread creeping back. She pictured the chaos, the gunfire, the cruelty she had been told was hidden in the man she now tried to understand. That evening, when she looked from her window, she saw him sitting on the porch, rifle resting across his knees, his gaze steady on the horizon. He was not restless, not harsh. He sat like a rock against the storm, unshaken. That sight quieted her fear, for his strength was not wild, it was protective, like a wall built to shield, not to harm. The attack came the next afternoon. Dust rose in the distance, shouts echoing across the pasture as riders charged in, firing into the air to scatter the herd. Panic gripped the land. Cattle lowed in terror, men shouted, dogs barked in frenzy. Nayeli's breath caught as she stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. In one swift motion, the cowboy mounted his horse, his voice cutting through the chaos, sharp but not cruel. "Hold the line! Protect the herd!" His men obeyed instantly, their fear steadied by his command. She watched with her heart pounding, expecting to see rage in his actions. But what unfolded before her eyes was not cruelty, it was courage. He rode into the chaos with sharp precision, guiding men, blocking rustlers, his movements quick but controlled. When a ranch hand fell, struck hard by a fleeing thief, she saw the cowboy dismount, shield the man with his own body, and fire a warning shot that made the rustlers scatter. He pulled the injured worker to safety, his face set not in anger but in fierce determination to protect. The clash ended with dust settling and cattle calming, the thieves driven back. When silence fell again, he did not boast of victory, did not rage at his men for faltering. Instead, he knelt by the injured hand, tearing his own shirt to bandage the wound, his voice low and healing as he gave instructions. Nayeli's eyes blurred with tears, she did not try to stop. The stories had called him ruthless, but what she saw was strength, guided by fairness, fire tempered with care. That evening, as the ranch settled once more, she sat on the porch, her heart heavy with questions. He came to sit near her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the weight of his presence. The silence stretched until he spoke, his tone quiet, almost sad. "You've heard many things about me, haven't you?" Her throat tightened as she nodded. His eyes searched the fields as though speaking to the land itself. "Ruthless," he said, the word soft but edged with weariness. "That's what they call me. I've done what I had to do. Out here, if you don't stand firm, if you don't fight when danger comes, people die. And when you don't bend, they say you have no heart." She dared to lift her gaze to him, her breath trembling. His voice grew gentler, carrying a truth she had not expected. But I don't raise my hand without reason. I don't hurt the weak. I don't fight unless it must be done. That's the truth. In the glow of the lantern, she saw not steel in his face, but weariness, longing even, the burden of a man judged by shadows of his past. Her chest ached with a rush of understanding. She whispered, her voice breaking, "I thought you would be cruel to me." His eyes softened, turning toward her fully for the first time. "I won't be. Not ever." The words landed deep, breaking the last chains of fear in her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not born of dread. They were born of release, of healing. That night, she sat beside him by the fire, not with distance, but with a quiet closeness. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy, but gentle, like a river carrying them forward together. As days passed, her steps grew lighter. She no longer hid in her small room, but walked the ranch with ease. She helped feed chickens, carried water, even laughed quietly when dogs tumbled over her feet. When she caught his eyes now, her heart no longer leapt with fear, but with a steady warmth. She saw the small details others ignored, how he checked every fence himself, how he gave his horse an apple before eating his own food, how he stood on the porch at dusk, not as a man brooding in anger, but as one watching over his land. She realized then that his silence was not emptiness. It was thought, it was care, it was presence. One morning she dared to speak more than a single question. "Have the cattle calmed since the attack?" His eyes met hers, steady and sure. "They'll settle. They always do." A small smile touched her lips at his answer, a smile she no longer tried to hide. Their exchanges grew into small conversations about seasons, about floods and droughts, about loyalty and the men who worked beside him. She began to see through his words the man beneath the rumors, a man who valued fairness, patience, and quiet honor. The ranch hands noticed the change too. One evening, an older worker told her gently, "Ma'am, you'll see soon enough. He's fair." Tough, yes, but fair. Don't let the old tales fool you. She nodded, her heart swelling with a warmth she could not name. Later, while preparing food, she cut her hand on a knife. Before she could even cry out, he was at her side, wrapping the wound carefully, his voice calm as he soothed her fear. She looked at him then, truly looked, and the walls of dread collapsed completely. That night, as the fire crackled and workers spoke in soft tones nearby, she sat close to him, her hand bandaged but her heart unbound. She thought back to the nights in her village when she had cried beneath her blanket, believing her life was over. How wrong she had been. Her life had not ended. It had begun anew. The fear that once silenced her had given way to trust, and from trust came the first fragile blossoms of something she had never dared hope for. She saw him not as ruthless, but as a protector, a man whose strength was not cruelty, but love, waiting to be born in silence. And as the stars spread wide across the sky, Naeli closed her eyes, breathing deeply, her soul whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. Healing had entered her life not with loud promises, but with steady acts of care, like drops of water shaping stone. She no longer feared the days ahead. She welcomed them, for in them lay the promise of something she once thought impossible: hope for love. The mornings at the ranch grew softer for Nayeli, as if the land itself had accepted her presence and opened its arms to her. Dawn broke with the smell of dew on grass and the gentle sound of cattle lowing, and each day she rose no longer weighed down by dread, but guided by curiosity and quiet hope. She found herself drawn into the rhythm of life around her, into the steady heartbeat of the ranch that pulsed with both labor and calm. The men began to greet her as one of their own, not with the stiffness of duty, but with the warmth of genuine respect. Even the dogs, once hesitant, now wagged their tails and followed her with joyful loyalty. It was a subtle healing, a slow unraveling of the knots fear had tied around her spirit. The cowboy remained much the same, silent, watchful, carrying his strength like a mantle he neither flaunted nor set aside. Yet in that silence she began to see the language he spoke, the way he always checked the water troughs before resting, the way he bent to mend a fence alongside his men rather than commanding from afar, the way he lifted burdens from others without complaint. His presence filled the ranch not with the shadow of ruthlessness, but with the quiet certainty of a man who anchored everything around him. She began to realize that strength did not always roar. It could be steady, like the earth beneath one's feet, unseen but essential. Nayeli tested her courage in small ways. She walked beyond the porch to feed chickens, her laughter breaking free when one pecked playfully at her skirt. She carried buckets of water, her arms trembling, but her spirit proud when she finished the task. Each time she braced for correction, for harshness, but each time he only nodded in quiet approval, his eyes softening for a brief moment before turning back to his work. Those moments planted seeds of confidence that grew gently, watered by his patience. One evening, as dusk settled like a golden shawl across the hills, a storm began to roll in. The clouds stretched heavy and thunder rumbled low. Nayeli's heart tensed, memories of the last storm rising to grip her. She returned to her small room, clutching the quilt, bracing for fear. But when she opened her door slightly, there it was again, the lantern placed carefully outside, its glow steady against the gathering dark. A lump rose in her throat. She pressed her palm to her lips, tears filling her eyes, not from terror, but from the healing comfort of a simple gesture. He had remembered. He had thought of her. And in that moment, she felt safe, in a way she had never known. The following days deepened her sense of belonging. She began to speak more, asking questions about the land, about the herds, about the seasons that shaped their lives. His answers were always steady, often simple, but they carried weight. He spoke of floods that had swept away fields, of droughts that had tested their strength, of winters that had demanded endurance. And always his words carried a thread of hope, that no matter how harsh the season, life returned, grass grew again, cattle thrived once more. His voice became a kind of healing to her, a reminder that even after loss or fear, the earth renews itself. The men noticed her courage blossoming. One older hand, with lines deep on his face, paused to speak kindly to her. "You'll see soon enough, miss. He's tough but fair. Folks may whisper, but we know the truth." His words stayed with her, weaving themselves into the tapestry of trust she was slowly stitching together in her heart. Still, there were moments when the old whispers echoed. One afternoon, she overheard men talking of his past, of battles fought with unyielding strength, of how he had stood alone against danger without flinching. "That's why people call him Ruthless," they said. Naeli felt the old fear stir again, but it no longer ruled her. Instead, it blended with her growing knowledge, forming questions rather than dread. Could it be that the world mistook firmness for cruelty, courage for mercilessness? She began to see that stories often left out the truth. The quiet evenings, the small kindnesses, the healing presence no one spoke of. One day, while helping in the kitchen, she cut her hand on a blade. The sight of blood frightened her, and she tried to hide it, but before she could, he was beside her. He wrapped her wound with gentle care, his voice low and calming. "You'll be all right," he said, his words carrying not command but reassurance. She looked into his eyes then, truly looked, and what she saw broke away the last remnants of the shadow she had carried. His eyes were not cold. They were steady, yes, but within them lived patience, sorrow, and a quiet depth of care. That small act, that healing touch, told her more than any tale ever could. From that moment, something changed within her. She no longer feared speaking her thoughts, and her laughter began to slip out in small bursts, lightening the air around her. When she looked at him now, she no longer turned away quickly. She studied his face, noticing how the lines softened when he watched the land, how his hands lingered gently on the horses, how his silence was never empty but filled with thought. Slowly, admiration bloomed, tender and quiet, yet undeniable. One evening, as the sky burned with hues of red and gold, she found herself seated beside him on the porch. They watched the fields in silence, the cattle grazing, the dogs lying near their feet. The wind brushed past them like a song. Naeli's voice rose softly, almost trembling, but filled with courage. "I was afraid of you." The words hung in the air, fragile yet strong. He did not flinch. He nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. Stories travel faster than truth." Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of release. "You are not ruthless," she whispered. His head turned, and his expression was gentle, almost surprised. "I'm glad you see that," he said. That moment marked a turning point. Between them, something fragile yet resilient began to take root, born not of grand gestures but of patience, trust, and small kindnesses that healed wounds carved by fear. The world beyond the ranch might still whisper his name with shadows, but Naeli's heart now knew a different truth. She no longer walked in dread, but in the light of discovery, seeing him not as the monster of stories, but as a man of honor, a protector whose strength was a shield, not a sword against her. Her journey had begun in trembling terror, but now, beneath the vast sky and within the steady rhythm of ranch life, she carried something new. It was not yet love, not fully, but it was hope. The tender hope that what had once been forced upon her might become the very thing her soul had longed for. And as the stars spread across the heavens that night, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the healing that patience and truth had brought, a prayer that tomorrow would bring her closer still to the heart she was beginning to trust. The morning sun stretched over the hills with a warmth that felt like a promise, and Naeli rose from her bed with a heart that no longer trembled at every sound. The ranch was no longer a prison to her. It had become a living place of rhythm and breath, of quiet laughter among the men, of dogs chasing dust motes, of horses stamping the ground as though the earth belonged to them. She moved among it now with steps less hesitant, carrying water, feeding chickens, brushing the porch, her presence woven into the fabric of daily life. She felt the change within herself. Fear no longer ruled her, though its shadow sometimes whispered. What grew stronger each day was trust, gentle, steady, healing trust. The cowboy remained as he always was, quiet and steady, but her eyes had learned to see what others missed. His silence was not emptiness. It was a kind of language spoken without words. She read it in the tilt of his head when he listened, in the way he lingered near the workers when they struggled, in the way he laid a hand on a restless horse until it calmed. She found herself waiting for those moments, storing them in her heart like small treasures. Each one softened her, made her breath come easier, her soul lighter. It was during these days of quiet growth that a new trial rose, testing the fragile peace she had found. Rumors carried from neighboring lands, traders whispering of unrest, of cattle thieves still lurking, of lawless men circling like vultures. The workers grew uneasy, their laughter more guarded, their eyes sharper as they scanned the horizon. Naeli felt the shift in the air, the heaviness that came before storms. She remembered the attack she had witnessed, the dust and chaos, the fear that had clenched her chest. And though she no longer believed the man beside her to be cruel, she wondered if fear might find its way back into her heart. One evening, as the sun melted into crimson fire across the sky, she saw him standing at the edge of the porch, his silhouette etched against the fading light. He carried no weapon in his hands, yet his presence was enough to steady the unease that had crept into her. She stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "Are they coming back?" He did not turn at once, only let the silence stretch as if he was measuring the weight of the truth. Then he said, "Perhaps. Out here, trouble comes when it pleases, but we will be ready." His words were not meant to frighten her. They were steadying, like stone beneath bare feet. She found herself drawing breath more deeply, as though his calmness had entered her own lungs. The night passed in restless quiet. But when morning came, life resumed its rhythm. Naeli carried herself through the day with new strength, remembering his words, letting them root inside her. Fear still tried to whisper, but each time it did, she recalled the lantern he had left at her door, the bandage he had wrapped around her hand, the way his voice had told her she was safe. Those memories were her healing, and she clung to them as the air grew heavy with the promise of change. Days later, the storm came, not in rain, but in men. Dust rose once more on the horizon, shouts echoing, riders charging with wild fury. Naeli stood frozen at first, but then she saw him, mounting his horse in one swift motion, his voice ringing out with firm command. "Hold the line! Protect what's ours!" The men answered, not with hesitation, but with trust, their movements sharp and sure beneath his lead. She had expected to feel terror, but what filled her instead was awe. She watched him ride into danger, not with reckless rage, but with calm strength, guiding, shielding, commanding. Her breath caught when a man aimed a gun at him, the flash of metal glinting in the sun. But before the shot could fire true, he turned, swift and sure, disarming the man with a movement born not of cruelty, but of practiced resolve. He spared the outlaw's life, driving him away instead of cutting him down. That moment struck her more deeply than the clash itself. He was feared as ruthless. But here before her was a man who chose mercy even when strength gave him every right to destroy. When the rustlers were driven off, the ranch returned to uneasy quiet. The men gathered, some injured, some shaken, yet none broken. He moved among them with calm purpose, binding wounds, steadying nerves, speaking words that healed more than they commanded. Naeli stood at a distance, her chest tight with emotion. She had seen him tested, and what she had witnessed tore away the last remnants of rumor. The name Ruthless no longer fit him. He was firm, yes, and strong beyond measure, but his strength was tempered by fairness, his fire by restraint. She whispered a prayer of thanks that her eyes had been opened, that truth had revealed itself in the storm. That evening she found him sitting alone by the fire, the flames casting light across his face. His expression was quiet, shadowed with the weight of what had passed. She hesitated before stepping closer, but courage guided her. Her voice was soft, trembling but true. "You fought for them. For us. But you did not fight with hate." His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment silence stretched between them like a bridge. Then he said, low and weary, "Hate doesn't build anything. It only destroys. Out here, we fight to protect, not to take." Her heart swelled, her throat tight with unspoken words. She wanted to tell him that she understood now, that the man she had once feared had become the one her soul trusted most. But the words tangled in her chest. Instead, she sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, close enough to feel the steadiness of his presence. And in that closeness, something blossomed, fragile but undeniable, the tender beginning of love. The days that followed unfolded with new light. She no longer avoided his gaze, but met it with quiet strength. When he asked her thoughts, she spoke them softly, and when she laughed, he listened as though her voice carried weight. She began to walk beside him during the evening rounds, her steps matching his, her heart steady in his company. The workers noticed, their smiles quiet, their respect deeper. One night, as the stars spilled across the sky, Naeli lay awake in her small room, her thoughts spinning. She remembered the girl who had once wept into her blanket, believing her life was over. That girl had been silenced by fear, trapped by whispers. But now she breathed in the scent of the ranch, heard the faint laughter of men outside, and felt the steady heartbeat of a life she had never imagined. Her walls had crumbled, her heart had healed, and in its place bloomed something precious. Hope for love, real and tender, waiting to grow with the dawn. The summer light stretched long over the plains, casting every blade of grass in gold, and Naeli's steps no longer carried hesitation. The ranch had become part of her breath, its rhythm flowing into her own heartbeat. She walked now with quiet confidence, her eyes lifted to the horizon instead of the ground, and her spirit, once bound in fear, moved freely like the wind that brushed her hair. Every day brought the same steady work, yet within that sameness she found something new, a sense of belonging that healed the hidden wounds left by whispered rumors. She could hear laughter at the barns and no longer shrink from it, for she knew it was not mocking her, but the simple joy of men sharing their burdens. The dogs lay at her feet when she rested, the horses lowered their heads when she passed, and the air itself seemed kinder, as though it had softened to welcome her. The cowboy remained constant, his silence as firm as the hills around them, yet she had come to know how to read it. She could feel the meaning behind the small tilt of his hat, the way his eyes lingered for a fraction longer when she walked into the room, the way he slowed his steps so she might walk beside him without rushing. She realized now that his quietness was not distance, but a space in which she was free to grow. In that space, she felt herself unfolding like a wild flower reaching toward the sun. One evening, as the air shimmered with the warmth of day fading into twilight, she joined him by the fence where the cattle grazed in slow peace. The sky was ablaze with colors, crimson melting into rose and deep indigo above. They stood side by side, not speaking, letting the silence stretch wide. But in that silence she felt more than words could ever give. She dared to look at him, really look, and saw how the light of the setting sun softened the lines of his face, how his eyes carried not coldness but depth, the weight of years and battles endured, and yet also a tenderness he never spoke aloud. Her chest tightened with something new, something tender and aching, the quiet beginning of love. The days turned into weeks, each one weaving them closer. Naeli began to join him on his rounds in the evenings, carrying a lantern as they checked the fences, her presence no longer an intrusion, but a steadying companion. Sometimes their hands brushed as he passed her a tool, and each touch left a ripple inside her, soft and healing, like water over stone. She found herself waiting for those moments, cherishing them in silence. He never forced words, but when she spoke, his eyes always turned to her as though what she said mattered. She told him of her village, of the songs her grandmother sang, of the fears that once consumed her, and he listened with a patience that wrapped around her like shelter. One night, the air was cool with the scent of rain, and Naeli lingered at the porch as he returned from the fields. He placed a small object on the step, a wildflower, delicate and bright, its stem still damp with dew. He said nothing, but she knew it was for her. She held it in her hands, her heart swelling with a warmth so deep it brought tears to her eyes. That simple act said more than 1,000 promises. She pressed the flower to her lips and whispered a prayer of thanks, not to him, but for him, for the gentleness that lived hidden behind his strength. Her courage grew, and with it, her laughter. At meals, she no longer ate in silence, but asked the workers questions, and sometimes they told her stories that made her smile. She noticed how he watched her then, not with possession, but with quiet pride, as though her laughter was a gift to him. The men respected him more than ever, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. They worked harder under his eye, not from dread, but from loyalty. And Naeli realized that the name Ruthless had been carved from ignorance. He was not ruthless. He was steadfast. And there was healing in steadfastness, for it gave her ground to stand upon. Still, there were nights when doubts flickered like shadows. She would remember the whispers from her cousins, the old tales of bloodshed, and her chest would tighten. But then she would recall his voice, steady and soft, telling her she was safe. She would remember the lantern at her door, the flower on her step, the cloth wrapped around her hand when she had been hurt. Those memories chased the shadows away, and she would fall asleep with peace warming her soul. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of pine through the fields, she sat beside him by the fire. The men spoke in quiet tones nearby, their laughter rising and falling like music. She turned her gaze to him, and her voice came softly, almost like a confession. "I thought I had lost my life when I left my village, but here I think I have found something I never expected." Her words trembled, but they were true. His eyes met hers then, steady, unwavering. He did not answer with speech, but with the faintest curve of his lips, the smallest smile she had ever seen him give. And in that smile she felt her heart finally rest. The following days carried with them a peace that wrapped around her like a shawl. She worked beside him when he let her, sometimes sweeping the porch, sometimes gathering herbs by the fence, sometimes only sitting near while he mended tools. Each moment wove another thread into the bond between them. When storms rolled across the plains again, she no longer trembled as before. She watched from her window, the lantern glowing steady at her door, and felt safe. She whispered healing prayers into the night, not for herself this time, but for him, that the weight he carried, the weariness in his eyes, might one day be lifted. Her heart no longer asked if he would hurt her. It no longer clung to the fears of yesterday. It asked instead something new, fragile but insistent. Could love grow here, in this soil once watered with her tears? Each gesture, each glance, each shared silence whispered yes. And though neither spoke the word aloud, love had already begun to bloom, quiet and strong, like roots reaching deep beneath the earth. The days at the ranch grew longer, brighter, and Naeli's steps grew light enough that even the earth seemed to welcome her. What had begun in trembling fear had become a rhythm of quiet trust, and trust blossomed into something deeper with each sunrise. She rose early now, not because she was commanded, but because she longed to walk into the golden light and hear the voices of men at work, to feel the breath of horses warm upon her palm, to carry the scent of grass and dust into her hair. She had become part of the land, part of the rhythm, part of him. And still her heart carried questions, for love, when it begins to bloom, is tender, uncertain, and asks for proof that it is real. The proof came with trial, as it often does. One evening, when the cattle had been driven close to the pens and the men sat resting by the barns, riders appeared in the distance. The rustlers had returned, bolder and more desperate than before. Their shouts cracked against the sky, their guns fired into the air, and once again dust rose thick upon the horizon. Naeli froze, her heart leaping into her throat, but then she saw him, mounting his horse in one swift motion, his rifle at his side, his voice ringing out strong and steady. "Stand fast. Protect each other." The chaos that followed was louder, sharper, more dangerous than before. The rustlers pressed hard, trying to scatter the herd, trying to break the line of men who fought to defend their home. Naeli's hands shook as she clutched the porch rail, her eyes wide with terror and awe. She saw him ride into the storm like a force of nature, not wild with rage, not reckless with fury, but fierce with purpose. He moved with precision, his commands guiding his men like a river cutting through stone. He shielded the weak, steadied the faltering, and turned back the attackers with a strength that carried no cruelty, only courage. Her breath caught when one rustler broke through, riding close with a gun aimed at him. Time seemed to slow, fear screaming in her chest. But with a calmness that stole her breath, he turned, his shot ringing true, disarming without killing. The man fled, and in that moment Naeli understood the truth of him in full. He was not ruthless. He was resolute. His strength was not a weapon of destruction, but a shield of protection. When the dust finally settled and the rustlers fled into the hills, the ranch stood firm. Cattle were safe, the men alive, though bruised and tired. He moved among them with calm assurance, binding wounds with cloth, steadying hands that trembled, offering words that healed more than they commanded. Naeli watched him from a distance, tears streaming silently down her face. She saw him as he truly was, a man of honor, carrying his burdens without complaint, giving his strength not to terrify but to protect. And her heart broke open in gratitude and love. That night, the fire burned bright against the darkness, and the men sat close, their voices low and weary, but filled with respect. Naeli sat beside him at last, no longer apart, no longer trembling. Her voice rose softly, a whisper meant only for him. "I know who you are now." He turned his gaze to her, steady and patient, waiting. Her hand shook as she placed it upon his, the first time she had dared such closeness. "You are not ruthless. You are the reason I feel safe." His eyes softened then, the hard lines of his face gentled by her words. He did not speak much, but the way his hand turned to hold hers said more than speech ever could. In that touch, she felt every wall crumble, every fear dissolve, every wound within her spirit begin to heal. She had walked a road of dread, but it had led her here, to the man who was not the shadow of rumor, but the light of truth. The days that followed were filled with quiet transformations. She laughed more often now, and when she did, he listened as though the sound was a treasure. She spoke freely, and he answered, his words never rushed but always sure. Sometimes they worked side by side in silence, sometimes they shared small stories as the evening sky blazed with fire, and sometimes they said nothing at all, letting the quiet carry them. Each moment stitched them closer, their bond woven not by grand gestures, but by the healing power of patience, of presence, of trust. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the land in gold and crimson, Naeli stood with him on the porch. The fields stretched wide before them, the cattle grazing, the dogs dozing, the men's voices fading into laughter. She turned to him, her eyes bright with courage. "I was afraid when I came here. I thought my life was over. But now, it feels like it has just begun." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a true smile break across his face, small, quiet, but carrying the warmth of a dawn long awaited. She leaned closer, resting her head against his arm, and he did not move away. The air was soft, filled with the scent of earth and grass, the healing music of crickets rising. In that moment she knew. Love had come not like a fire that burned quickly, but like a river carving stone, slow, steady, enduring. It had healed her wounds, quieted her fears, and given her a home not just in a place, but in a heart. Her journey, once marked by tears and dread, had brought her here, to the beginning of love's promise. And as the stars spread wide across the night sky, Naeli whispered a prayer of gratitude, for the courage that had carried her, for the truth that had been revealed, and for the love that had bloomed where she least expected it. My dear friend, if this story touched something gentle in your heart, if it brought a little healing to your weary soul, let your voice be part of it. Leave a comment and share your thoughts, so that the fire of stories may burn brighter. Like this journey if it stirred hope within you, and subscribe so the next chapter may find you when you most need it. Your presence here is a gift, and every gesture of support keeps the light alive for more tales to come.